Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to picture 19th century London. It's a city of incredible wealth and mind-blowing progress, but it's also a city that is absolutely bursting at the seams. And for the poor, well, survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a daily battle, and it was fought on London's crowded, chaotic, and often really brutal streets.
The journalist Henry Mayhew, he just captured the sheer sensory overload of it all perfectly. The Victorian street wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing stage. It smelled, it screamed, and on that stage, 1,000 different stories of survival unfolded every single day. So today, we're going to explore two of those stories.
And we're going to begin by walking down one of the darkest paths. Let's step away from all those vibrant market cries for a second and look up, way up, towards the chimneys, because that's where we'll find the story of the climbing boys.
The poet William Blake gave a voice to these children, decades before the Victorian era even really kicked off. And his words, they still haunt. So many of these kids were orphans from the workhouses. Others were literally sold by their own desperate parents into the trade. We're talking about children as young as 3 or 4 years old, so small they could barely cry out weep, weep, weep for sweep.
Now, this number, 9 inches by 9 inches, I want you to really think about that. That was the standard size of a chimney flue. This was the suffocatingly small, dark space these children were forced to climb, and they often had to do it naked so their clothes wouldn't snag, using just their elbows and knees to scrape the soot from the inside.
The consequences were just horrific. Their small bodies were twisted into these unnatural shapes, which led to terrible bone deformities. Their lungs were just filled with soot. Their eyes burned constantly, and sometimes they'd get stuck and suffocate right there in the flue. And it's a big if they survived into their teens, they often faced a vicious cancer directly linked to their trade. For most, it was a short, brutal life.
And here's the kicker. This whole system was legally sanctioned. They were called apprentices, but let's be real about what this was. It was a form of legalized, forced child labor. A master sweep would often get paid by the local parish to take a child off their hands, and that kid was then bound to him until they were an adult, with absolutely no way out.
So for the climbing boys, survival was just a nightmare of exploitation. But was this the only story playing out on these streets? Was everyone a victim? Let's head back down to street level and find out.
Because this is where we find a completely different kind of survivor. Someone who carved out a life not through exploitation, but through sheer grit and ingenuity. I'm talking about the costermonger.
So the name itself comes from costard, which was a type of apple, and monger, which just means a seller. Basically, these were the city's mobile greengrocers. They were the vital circulatory system of London, buying up produce at huge wholesale markets and then selling it in small, affordable amounts to the working classes right on their doorsteps.
And this was not some niche job. I mean, look at this. In the 1840s alone, Henry Mayhew estimated there were tens of thousands of them. Men, women, and children. It was an entire thriving, informal economy powered by barrows, baskets, and very, very loud voices.
And they sold everything. I mean, it wasn't just apples. They offered hot food for workers who didn't have kitchens. Things like fried fish or sheep's trotters. Small luxuries like flowers. A hot drink of coffee or salop. Jellied eels. They were basically a one-stop shop for the daily needs of the poor.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The costermongers were so much more than just sellers. They were a community. They formed this proud, fiercely independent subculture with their own look, their own language, and their very own rules.
They had this really distinct style, a kind of uniform of pride. Corduroy, bell-bottoms, a silk neckerchief. But the most important element, the real showstopper, was the flashy rows of mother-of-pearl buttons sewn all over their clothes. This wasn't just decoration. This was a status symbol.
And they even had a secret language. You see, costers were famously hostile to the police, or as they called them, the SLOP. So to communicate without being understood, they used backslang, which is pretty much what it sounds like. They just said words backwards. A yob for a boy, a yinup for a penny. It was a real code of the street.
This pride, it was literally worn right on their sleeves. That love of pearly buttons, which was a way of measuring your status, eventually evolved into the iconic pearly kings and queens. Now, these weren't actual royalty. They were respected figures elected from within the coster community to keep the peace and represent their interests. So here we have these two starkly different stories of survival, both born on the very same streets. On one hand, you have the silenced children, And on the other, the loud and proud entrepreneurs. And together, they show us the great paradox of Victorian London, a city of progress and culture built on both shocking exploitation and incredible resilience. Eventually, of course, the streets changed. The terrible plight of the climbing boys led to public outcry, and finally an effective law in 1875 that ended the practice for good. For the costermongers, though, it was a different battle. They fought tooth and nail against authorities who wanted to regulate them off the streets. But what really led to their decline was something simpler: the rise of modern shops and home refrigeration.
So here's what you should really take away from all this. It's the profound contrast. The climbing boys survived through exploitation, with zero agency and no voice. The costermongers survived through pure ingenuity, fiercely independent and proud. One became a symbol of a terrible injustice we needed to correct. The other, a symbol of a vibrant working-class culture that we've now largely lost. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? The specific cries of the muffin man and the sweep, well, they've faded into history. But the fundamental forces that put them on the street in the first place, poverty, the need for flexible work, that constant hustle to survive, they haven't disappeared. So it makes you wonder, who are their modern-day equivalents? Who are the hidden workers and street entrepreneurs of our world today?